Ukraine just launched its biggest ever missile and drone blitz against Russia, and in doing so, it may have just crippled Putin's war machine forever. In what's being called an intelligent triple-tap attack, Ukraine targeted Russian oil refineries, weapons production plants, and much more in a strike intended to decimate Putin's ability to keep his troops armed on the front lines. The knock-on effect will be that Ukraine now faces a weakened Russia, especially in the embattled Donetsk region, allowing it to not only put up a stronger defense against those invading forces, but to push them back closer to the border. This attack is a game-changer for the Ukraine war. But what exactly did Ukraine manage to achieve with its triple-tiered strike against Russia? Why does the attack matter, and how has Russia responded? We answer all of those questions in this video as we examine how Ukraine just devastated the Russian war machine. So, what actually happened? On January 14th, the BBC, Reuters, and Al Jazeera were all among the first to report on Ukraine's strike, with much of their information coming from Ukraine itself. The BBC reports that Ukraine is calling this strike its most massive of the war so far, with multiple targets being hit using a combination of drones, US-supplied ATACMS long-range missiles, and British Storm Shadow missiles. The use of these two weapons is telling. Both allow Ukraine to strike deep into Russian territory, and that's precisely what Ukraine did. The BBC's report says that some of Ukraine's targets were hundreds of kilometers from the border, while Ukraine's SBU intelligence agency called the tiered attack a painful blow to Russia's ability to wage war. They're not wrong. Ukraine's strike forced at least 9 of Russia's airports to temporarily cease operations, in addition to forcing the closure of several schools in the country's Saratov region. But those were just the after effects of Ukraine's massive strike. Kyiv targeted some of the most valuable Russian assets sitting behind the front lines of Russian President Vladimir Putin's special military operation, including oil refineries, chemical plants, and ammunition depots in Bryansk. A Ukrainian official told the BBC that the chemical plant Ukraine targeted produced explosives and gunpowder for Russia's weapons, with its loss meaning that less of both will make their way to the front lines. A pair of industrial plants in Saratov and Engels were also damaged in Ukraine's massive drone and missile assault, as was a target that Kyiv claims was an astonishing 700 miles away from the border that Ukraine shares with Russia. And there's more. The strike came on the back of another conducted the previous week that devastated an oil storage facility in Engels, causing a massive blaze that took Russia's firefighters several days to put out and prompting the declaration of a state of emergency in the city. A few days later, on January 14th, Ukraine launched additional drone attacks, hitting a gas storage facility in Tatarstan and targeting Tula, where Russia claimed to have shot down 16 unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs. At the time, these attacks were viewed as separate strikes. Now the truth is clear. They were all part of a coordinated assault by Ukraine, designed to take out some of the most valuable assets Russia has at its disposal. Reuters' report on the massive strike provided more details from Russia itself. It says that the attacks damaged key facilities in at least 3 Russian cities, though, as is so often the case, Russia is trying to conduct some damage control. Moscow claims via the SHOT Telegram channel that it managed to shoot down 200 Ukrainian drones, along with 5 of Ukraine's ATACMS missiles, during the multi-day assault. The number of destroyed drones is possible, especially given the tactics Ukraine used to launch this strike, which we'll reveal in just a moment. As for shooting down 5 ATACMS, that's far less likely. Reuters also went into more detail about the Saratov and Engels strike, noting that Ukraine hit the region twice in as many weeks. The first of those strikes destroyed the oil depot we mentioned previously, with Reuters adding the extra bit of information that this depot stores oil Russia uses for its nuclear bomber planes. So not only has Ukraine taken those planes out of commission in terms of their ability to use conventional bombs against Ukraine, but it's also reduced Putin's immediate nuclear threat. Of course, Russia claimed it would retaliate against the massive Ukrainian strike. And it did, but we'll get to that later. Next, we'll explore just how Ukraine managed to carry out this triple-tap attack to strike Russia multiple times in 2 weeks, despite Russia's aerial defenses. It all comes down to a very clever decoy approach. We mentioned earlier that Russia says it shot down around 200 of the drones Ukraine used to conduct these assaults. The problem, from the Russian perspective, is that the majority of these drones likely weren't even intended to hit any Russian targets. They were decoys launched into the air to distract Russia's aerial defenses, while other drones and Ukraine's long-range missiles penetrated to cause the bulk of the damage. January 14th amounted to what Ukraine called a fiery night for Russia, with authorities in Kyiv also seeming to state that Russia's claims to have shot down 14 ATACMS and Storm Shadows are inaccurate. When asked by the BBC to comment on the claim, Ukraine's General Staff spokesperson Bohdan Senik only had this to say: "We have no knowledge of the information you're asking about." In other words, Russia didn't shoot down 14 of Ukraine's missiles, at least according to Ukraine. Most, if not all, got through, and they caused untold damage to Russia's war machine. And that brings us to another question. Just why is Ukraine's most massive aerial strike against Russia so devastating to Putin's war machine? It all comes down to the targets Ukraine chose to obliterate with its missiles and drones. Let's start with oil refineries. On January 11th, early into the two-week aerial assault on Russia, Ukraine successfully hit an oil refinery in Tatarstan. Operated by Tanaco, the refinery was among the most modern Russia has available to it and is responsible for transforming up to 16 million tons of crude oil per year into usable petroleum products, such as diesel and gasoline. Therein lies the reason why Ukraine honed in on the refinery. As Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation head Andriy Kovalenko says, the destruction of refineries and oil depots directly affects Russia's ability to wage an intense war. He's absolutely correct. Refined oil is not only a mainstay of Russia's economy. Russia's combined oil and gas revenues were $108 billion in 2024 alone, but it's also needed by the troops Putin sends to the front lines in Ukraine. Refineries pump out the diesel Russia needs to keep its tanks running. They create gasoline for armed vehicles and fuel for airplanes, all of which Putin wants to use to support his forces on the ground. With oil refineries going up in smoke, Russia loses the ability to turn its unusable crude into fuel to feed its fighters on the front lines. The result is that Russia's attacks against Ukraine's defensive positions are weakened. Tanks are disabled not because they're damaged, but because they don't have the fuel they need to take part in assaults. The same goes for armored vehicles, and every plane that's grounded due to a lack of fuel is a plane that Russia can't use to launch its devastating glide bombs at Ukrainian cities. Pressure is reduced on the Ukrainian soldiers fighting for their lives in the embattled Donetsk region. As for Russia's soldiers, less access to the mechanized units powered by the fuel Ukraine is destroying means they're increasingly forced to attack Ukraine's defenses on foot in human wave assaults. Ukraine cuts those soldiers down far easier than it would if they were protected by tanks and armored vehicles, which all adds up to Russia losing more soldiers than it otherwise would were it not for these refinery attacks. It's for these reasons that Ukraine targeted Russia's refineries in its attacks leading up to January 14, 2025. And the grim reality for Russia is that Ukraine has been taking out its refineries throughout 2024. Drone strikes in June 2024 took out oil storage sites and refinery equipment in Rostov and Voronezh. Earlier in the year, Ukraine also targeted similar facilities in Slavyansk, Volgograd, Kaluga, and Krasnodar. The January massive strike is just one of many designed to make it harder for Russia to keep its troops stocked up with fuel and to produce oil that it can sell to fund Putin's war machine. There is also a symbolic aspect of the oil refinery strike in Tatarstan to consider. That Russian republic is around 700 miles away from the front lines of the war. Nobody living or working there would have ever expected Ukraine to be able to attack at such a long range. But it happened, and Ukraine's latest strike proves that it can hit Russian targets all over the border regions with drones and missiles. That creates a massive morale problem for Putin. So long positioned as Russia's great protector, Putin is now having to deal with attacks on his territory. The Kursk invasion of August 2024 even showed Russia's people that Ukraine is capable of bringing the war to their doorsteps directly, not just with long-range attacks. For Russia, all of these strikes mean that Putin's special military operation can no longer be considered something that's just going on in another country. It's hitting Russia's people. It's hurting them. It's even destroying the natural resources that are so important to keeping their country's economy going. Of course, oil refineries and storage facilities were far from the only things Ukraine targeted with this blitz. It also took out Russian ammunition depots. Saratov was the main target here, located about 310 miles away from the Ukraine war's front lines. Saratov's proximity to Ukraine made it a vital cog in Putin's war machine. Beyond its own oil refinery, which Ukraine has targeted in the past, it's home to storage facilities for the glide bombs and cruise missile Putin has used in his own aerial assaults against Ukraine. Those glide bombs are especially terrifying. Made using Soviet-era bombs equipped with special fold-out wings that cost between $20,000 and $30,000 each, these powerful weapons demonstrate Putin's approach to the war. They aren't precise, they're barely even targeted. Instead, Russia straps wings to massive bombs weighing well over a ton and containing 440 pounds of explosives or more to devastate Ukraine's cities. Russia resorted to using them when it spectacularly failed to make its aerial advantage count over the skies of Ukraine. Rather than risking more planes and helicopters, it lost 369 of the former and 331 of the latter, mostly during the first months of its invasion. It instead has its bombers launch glide bombs from behind the war's front lines. The special wing kits allow those bombs to glide, hence the name, for dozens of miles before they touch down on a target. It doesn't matter to Russia how accurate these bombs are, as long as they hit home in a Ukrainian city. They cause colossal damage to buildings and any unfortunate citizens caught in their blasts. Those bombs have become key to Russia's war machine. March 2024 alone saw Putin send 3,000 glide bombs Ukraine's way, and the numbers haven't really let up since. That's why the ammunition depot strikes in Saratov are so important. By taking out a massive stash of Russian glide bombs along with cruise missiles, Ukraine limits Russia's ability to pelt its cities with aerial attacks. And just like we see with the refinery strikes, that can only mean bad news for Russian soldiers on the ground and great news for Ukraine's brave defenders. The Russian soldiers not only lose their tanks and armored vehicles because they can't fuel them, but they also can't attack Ukrainian positions that are being weakened by massive bombs. Ukraine gets to focus its defense on the human waves of Russians being sent its way, racking up more casualties and weakening Putin's war machine even further. Therein lies the point of Ukraine's massive blitz. Taking out ammunition depots and oil refineries has the direct effect of depriving Russia's troops of both of these valuable assets. But it's perhaps the knock-on effects Ukraine values most. Less pressure placed on its defenders, more vulnerable Russian soldiers, and tons of money being drained from Russia's coffers as it tries to recover from Ukraine's aerial assaults. Is it any wonder that Ukraine has been targeting Russia's ammo depots since the summer of 2022? It's found Putin's Achilles heel because it knows that destroying these depots weakens Russia's war machine both on the front lines and in terms of the money being poured into its stressed weapons production facilities. Speaking of weapons production, that brings us to the chemical plants Ukraine targeted during its massive attack. Bryansk was one of the many targets of Ukraine's strike. And it is, or was, home to a chemical plant that is now a flaming wreckage. That plant was close to the war's front lines, being just 62 miles away. It's also home to multiple industrial facilities, with 3 of those being damaged in Ukraine's blitz. This time it was ATACMS missiles that did the majority of the damage. According to Andriy Kovalenko, the plant Ukraine targeted was important for the production of artillery ammunition and missiles for the Russian army. He calls such production one of the key elements of Russian military industry, to highlight why Ukraine attacked it. Artillery is one of the areas in which Russia has a massive advantage over Ukraine, at least when it comes to pure numbers. Even with over 22,000 of those systems having been destroyed by Ukraine's defenders, Russia still has around 5,000 artillery units in the field, about 1,000 of which are self-propelled, and many more awaiting refurbishments in Russia's Soviet-era storage facilities. But here's the thing about artillery. It needs shells to be of any use. Therein lies one of the key challenges Putin's war machine has faced during the Ukraine war. He needs to keep those artillery units stocked up with shells to maintain Russia's constant bombardments on Ukrainian positions. That's why he's happily accepted more than 9 million shells from North Korea since the beginning of the conflict. Russia has been burning through its ammunition to the point where its own production can't keep up, and it's having to rely on foreign powers to keep it supplied. Keeping that in mind, you see why Ukraine is targeting chemical plants used to make components for Russia's artillery shells. Those plants being out of commission means that Russia's domestic production falters. It has to get more shells from its partners, which take time and effort to transport. All the while, the shells Russia's soldiers would have used on the front lines are no longer coming, taking away yet another weapon they could have used to batter Ukrainian positions. Combine that lack of artillery ammunition with the oil, glide bomb, and cruise missile destruction we've already mentioned, and it's clear just how intelligent Ukraine's most massive aerial assault was. It took out ammunition depots and oil to stop assets that were ready for transport from reaching Russian soldiers. But it's also focused attacks on the facilities responsible for building Russia's weapons, demonstrating combined short and long-term tactics to decimate Putin's war machine. That wasn't all. A microelectronics plant in Bryansk was also targeted by Ukraine's massive strike, again with the goal of taking out a facility that manufactures parts needed for Russia's weapons. In this case, the parts are vital for Russia's missiles and air defense systems, essentially the most high-tech weapons Russia has at its disposal. Again, there's the pressure-reducing effect that comes from forcing Russia into a position where it can make fewer weapons. But think about what this means in the context of future Ukrainian strikes. Russia's aerial defenses are now much weaker. It doesn't have the electronic components it needs to build more, and its missile production has been hampered. Should Ukraine want to launch another aerial assault on Russia, and there's no reason it wouldn't, Putin will find it even harder to defend his country against it. Finally, there are also suggestions that Ukraine managed to hit a Gazprom facility, responsible for producing liquefied natural gas, or LNG. Gazprom is one of the largest state-owned energy companies in Russia, making this strike a direct slap in the face to Putin, as he relies on this company to keep money pumping into his coffers. The attack apparently hit 3 tanks, setting them all on fire, to burn up Russia's precious supplies of gas. LNG has been a target for Ukraine since the beginning of 2025. Despite the massive number of sanctions placed against it, Russia somehow ascended to become Europe's second-largest supplier of LNG in 2024. The Guardian reports that ships carrying the gas transported 19.6 million tons of LNG to the continent during the year, which is a 2.2 million ton increase on 2023's numbers. A further 49.5 billion cubic meters of gas arrived in Europe via Russia's gas pipelines, which run through Turkey and a pipeline in Ukraine. You can see where this is going. Ukraine's attack on an LNG facility will drastically reduce the amount of this form of gas that Russia can ship to European countries. Those countries will feel the sting, but this seems like a case of Ukraine taking matters into its own hands to remind the rest of Europe that it's supposed to be reducing its reliance on Russia's energy resources. On top of the attack, Ukraine has also stopped the flow of Russian gas to European Union countries via the pipeline that flows through its country. That move comes off the back of the ending of a 5-year contract that kept the pipeline open during the war. It's also perfectly timed to go along with Ukraine's most massive aerial assault on Russia. As Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky put it, his country would no longer allow Russia to earn additional billions on our blood. About 30% of Europe's gas flows through this pipeline, so it's clear that Ukraine is willing to make Europe feel the sting to get its message across. So where does all of this leave Putin's war machine? Ukraine has taken out valuable oil and gas supplies, both of which sting Russia economically and, in the case of refined oil, weaken Russia's troops on the front lines against Ukraine. It's decimated Russian ammunition storage facilities, destroying the artillery shells and glide bombs Putin uses to pelt Ukraine's cities as he tries to gain more territory. It's even taken a long-term approach with the assault by shattering chemical and microelectronics plants to prevent Russia from building more of its artillery shells, missiles, and aerial defense units, making Russia more vulnerable to future attacks. Putin's war machine has been crippled, and he's not happy about it. Russia vowed revenge for Ukraine's massive series of aerial strikes, and it followed through on those threats just a day after the final January 14th strike landed. Russia unleashed a massive missile and drone attack of its own, targeting Ukraine's power grids in several regions as it tries to hit Kyiv where it hurts during the winter. Zelensky said, "Another massive Russian attack. It is the middle of winter, and the target for the Russians remains the same, our energy sector." Ukraine says the attack saw Russia launch 43 cruise and ballistic missiles along with 74 attack drones, with 30 of the former and 47 of the latter being shot down by Ukraine's aerial defenses. The attack, led by Russian Tu-22 and Tu-95 bombers, also took place close to Ukraine's border with Poland, placing Warsaw on high alert and forcing it to scramble its own fighter jets. Duty fighter pairs have been scrambled, and ground-based air defense and radar reconnaissance systems have reached the highest state of readiness, read a statement from Poland. The steps taken are aimed at ensuring security in the areas bordering the threatened areas. So there's still life in the Russian war machine yet. But make no mistake, Ukraine's most massive aerial strike has caused some major damage to Putin's imperialistic ambitions. He's lost oil, gas, weapons, and even the facilities needed to build parts for ammunition. The question now is, can Ukraine sustain these assaults to cripple Putin's war machine forever? Let us know your thoughts about that, and whether you think this series of airstrikes is as big a win for Ukraine as it seems. Will Russia recover from these losses? Where do you see the war going in the future? Tell us in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out Ukraine Destroys Russia's Biggest Industry, or click this other video instead.